It started on a Wednesday morning when I found a folded piece of paper wedged into my dock gate, fluttering against the breeze like a smug little flag of bureaucracy. Violation notice number 001. It read in bold, accusing font. My crime? Apparently, unpermitted private harbor usage. Which was impressive, considering the harbor was on my property, built and maintained entirely by me, and had been there since before half the neighborhood even existed. I remember laughing out loud, thinking it had to be some kind of prank until I saw the signature at the bottom. Karen Whitmore, HOA President. That name alone carried the same energy as a thunderclap on a clear day. She was the type who smiled with her teeth but not her eyes, and whose every conversation sounded like a warning dressed as a compliment. The kind who believed a clipboard could substitute for authority. I'd seen her at meetings before, swanning in with her pearl necklace and her laminated bylaws, talking about community standards, like she owned the sunset. By Friday, 2 more notices had arrived. One for improper signage, she didn't like the small private dock plaque I'd put up years ago, and one for unauthorized mooring. She even included a grainy photo of my own fishing boat, as if catching me in the act. I ignored the first few, thinking reason would eventually prevail. But reasoning with Karen was like trying to explain gravity to a helium balloon. The more you tried, the higher she floated in her own self-importance. It didn't help that my harbor, though private, happened to border the neighborhood's scenic walking trail, meaning that technically, people like her could see it from the path, and seeing something seemed to automatically make it theirs. That was the kind of logic Karen operated on. When the 5th complaint arrived, this time about noise disturbances caused by my non-existent jet skis, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting in person. The community hall smelled faintly of coffee and disapproval. Karen presided over the room like a judge in pearls, with her husband, Greg, sitting silently beside her, nodding like a wind-up bobblehead. She introduced me as the owner of the disputed harbor, in a tone that suggested I was one step shy of arson. I calmly explained that my property deed included the shoreline, the dock, and everything extending 15 feet into the water. I even brought the documents. Karen squinted at them, pursed her lips, and said, "Well, that may be true, but the HOA bylaws grant U.S. oversight of all community-facing assets." I asked her to point out where community-facing was defined. She couldn't. Instead, she said, "It's implied." That's when I realized I was dealing with someone who didn't lose arguments. She just changed the rules until she won. By the end of that meeting, she had declared a temporary investigation into my harbor's status. Within a week, a bright orange pending violation sign appeared near my dock like a scarlet letter. Neighbors began whispering. Some even asked if I'd built it illegally. I'd spent years keeping that little waterfront neat, trimmed grass, oiled wood, polished rails, and now I watched as rumors spread like algae across calm water. I could have gone on the defensive, but instead, I decided to let Karen dig her own hole. She thrived on control. All I had to do was give her enough rope and patience. The next batch of complaints came rapid fire, each more absurd than the last. One claimed my solar-powered lights were environmentally disruptive. Another accused me of storing hazardous materials, a reference, I later learned, to a can of boat polish she'd photographed from the path. My favorite, though, was visual pollution. Apparently, my dock detracted from the natural lake aesthetic. I framed that one. Each notice came with a $100 fine proposal, though none were actually enforceable. I still didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I was waiting for the pattern to reveal itself. Every letter she sent was a record, and every record a potential receipt. The breaking point came one morning when I caught Karen herself on my dock, clipboard in hand, snapping photos like a wildlife photographer documenting illegal species. I stepped out quietly, let her click a few shots, and only spoke once she almost tripped on my cleat line. "You know," I said, "that's technically trespassing." She straightened, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "I'm conducting an inspection," she said. "For the HOA." I smiled. "Then where's your authorization?" She stammered something about implied jurisdiction. There it was again, her favorite legal term. I told her kindly that if she wanted to inspect my property, she'd need to request access through the proper channels. She left in a huff, muttering something about non-compliance. That afternoon, complaint number 16 arrived. I started a spreadsheet. Every notice went in. Date, alleged violation, and a short note about the absurdity. The pattern was glorious. She filed roughly one every 2 days, each citing a new interpretation of some vague HOA clause. I began referring to it privately as the Karen calendar. My wife thought it was hilarious. "You should invoice her," she joked one evening. "Charge her an access fee for every time she so much as looks at the harbor." I laughed, but the seed was planted. The 21st complaint was about commercial usage. Apparently, a friend of mine had parked his kayak for an afternoon, and she decided that constituted rental activity. That was when I drafted the first invoice, entirely tongue-in-cheek. "Private harbor access fee," it read. "One visual interaction with restricted waterfront asset, $250. I mailed it directly to Karen, complete with a faux logo and a payment due date. It was petty, sure, but satisfying. I figured she'd ignore it. Instead, she emailed me a full paragraph about how my fraudulent billing was a violation of HOA ethics policy. The irony nearly short-circuited my brain. At that point, the conflict had become a sport. She filed her 22nd, 23rd, and 24th complaints in 1 week. I responded with 22nd, 23rd, and 24th invoices, each referencing her original letter number. They were detailed, formatted like real administrative documents, citing visual encroachment, verbal disruption, and property interference. My lawyer friend, amused beyond belief, helped me phrase them just right so they sounded legal but weren't. Then came number 25, unsecured perimeter hazard, because apparently my dock gate latch was too shiny and might attract children. That one earned her a $500 inspection trespass fee. Neighbors started catching on. A few stopped me on walks just to ask, "So, is it true you're billing Karen?" Word spread like wildfire, and soon she was the one getting side-eyed at meetings. She tried to dismiss it all as defamation, but the documents spoke for themselves. Every time she wrote me, I wrote her back, one complaint, one invoice. When she finally hit number 27, accusing me of harbor-related visual intimidation, I still don't know what that even meant. I sent my masterpiece. A 12-page cumulative invoice, neatly itemized. 27 unauthorized access events, totaling $6,750. I included a professional letterhead, stamped envelope, and a friendly reminder at the bottom about timely payment to avoid collection procedures. I hand-delivered it to her mailbox. That night, she pounded on my door at 9:30 p.m., face red as a stop sign, waving the envelope like it was radioactive. "This is harassment," she screamed. "You can't charge me for looking at your stupid dock." I calmly pointed to the line that said, "Visual trespass incidents." She sputtered, realizing that every complaint she'd filed was now publicly mirrored in an equal and opposite document. My wife, barely holding in laughter, asked if she wanted a receipt. Karen stormed off, shouting that she'd see us in court. I closed the door, leaned against it, and exhaled. For the first time in weeks, the air around my harbor felt calm. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to retreat quietly. And sure enough, the next morning, a certified letter arrived from the HOA's attorney. The subject line read, "Formal review of alleged retaliatory conduct." The game, it seemed, had just changed. The letter from the HOA attorney looked official enough to scare someone who didn't know better. Heavy cream paper, embossed logo, the works. But when I opened it, I couldn't help but smirk. It was written in that same sanctimonious tone Karen loved to use, all pursuant to section, this and as stipulated under, that, except it wasn't actually signed by a real law firm. It was from the HOA's internal counsel, which in this case meant a retired insurance adjuster who volunteered his expertise between golf rounds. The gist was simple. I was being accused of retaliatory behavior against a board member and creating a hostile community environment through deceptive billing practices. I read it twice, then set it aside next to my coffee. My wife looked up from her laptop and asked, "So what's their latest fantasy?" I told her, and she laughed so hard she nearly spilled her drink. "They're suing you for invoices you never actually sent," she said. That's peak Karen logic. I knew better than to ignore it completely, though. Paper trails were Karen's love language, and she weaponized bureaucracy like a duelist with a sword. So, I called my actual attorney, Mark, who'd handled my property deed years ago. Mark was one of those men who looked like he was born in a courtroom, always calm, always one sentence away from dismantling whoever stood across from him. After scanning the HOA's letter, he chuckled. "This isn't even a proper legal threat," he said. "It's basically a sternly worded tantrum." Still, he advised that I respond in writing, briefly, professionally, and with attached copies of the very complaints Karen had filed. "If she wants to make this official," he said, "we'll bury her in her own paperwork." The next HOA meeting was more crowded than usual. Word of Harbigate, as my neighbor Dan had dubbed it, had spread across the community Facebook group. Karen sat at the front with her trademark poise, hair shellacked into submission, pretending not to notice the whispers. When my turn came, I stood up with a neat binder in hand and said, "Before we discuss alleged retaliation, I'd like to submit Exhibits A through AA, every complaint filed against me by this board's president." A ripple of laughter ran through the room. Karen's jaw tightened. I could practically see the steam forming behind her eyes. I continued, explaining that each invoice I'd sent her was a satirical response, a harmless joke mirroring her own barrage of paperwork. "If Ms. Whitmore finds satire hostile," I said, "perhaps the hostility originated in her filing cabinet." Even a few board members laughed, though they quickly pretended to cough when she glared at them. Karen tried to pivot, insisting that community assets, like the shoreline, should fall under HOA management. I asked her to define community assets. She fumbled, then quoted some vague clause about shared visual environments. I nodded solemnly and said, "So if I can see your pool from my property, do I get to regulate its chlorine levels?" The room erupted. Someone in the back muttered, "He's got a point." Karen's face went pink. The meeting adjourned early, for decorum reasons. That night, she sent a 700-word email to everyone in the HOA accusing me of mocking leadership authority and conduct unbecoming of a community member. I barely had to lift a finger before replies flooded in from amused neighbors. One even attached a meme of Karen holding a clipboard like a scepter. For the first time, the tide was turning. The more she tried to assert control, the more absurd she looked. Still, I didn't underestimate her. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. 3 days later, I woke up to find a bright yellow, "Stop Work Order" sign nailed to my dock gate. No signature, no official permit number. Just the HOA logo printed on copy paper. I laughed out loud. Karen had escalated from paper warfare to DIY law enforcement. That afternoon, as I was untacking the sign, I saw her approaching from the path, holding her phone like a camera crew. "You're tampering with an official notice," she shouted. I held up the flimsy sheet between 2 fingers. "Karen, this was printed on an inkjet. At best, it's a suggestion." She gasped like I'd just desecrated a sacred artifact and started dialing someone, probably Greg, her spineless shadow. I decided to make my next move a little more creative. The following morning, I erected a small bulletin board beside my dock. Sleek wood, brass frame, glass cover. Inside it, I posted copies of every complaint Karen had filed, neatly arranged in chronological order, complete with dates, subjects, and her signature. At the top, I labeled it, the Karen Archive. Neighbors walking by slowed down to read it. Some took photos. By sunset, it had become a local attraction. Even the joggers stopped to laugh. Karen showed up that evening, red-faced and furious, demanding I take down that defamatory display. I reminded her that all the documents were publicly issued HOA correspondence. Her own words. "I'm just exercising transparency," I said. She threatened to call the police. "Please do," I said. "I'll show them the archive. They might want to subscribe." True to form, she called them. A deputy arrived, looked at the board, and asked, "These are her complaints?" I nodded. He scanned them, trying not to grin. "Yeah, nothing illegal about displaying public correspondence," he said finally. "In fact, this might be the most organized evidence board I've ever seen." Karen looked ready to implode. The deputy tipped his hat to me and left. As he walked off, he muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "Ma'am, maybe stop filing nonsense." That night, she took to the neighborhood Facebook group again, accusing me of public harassment and defamation. By morning, her post had over 50 laughing reactions. But Karen wasn't one to lick her wounds quietly. She went silent for a week, which was somehow more unsettling than her daily theatrics. Then, one morning, I heard hammering. From my kitchen window, I saw her and Greg installing a tall privacy fence, right on the property line, partially blocking the view of my dock. I had to admit it was clever. Her plan was obvious. If she couldn't control my harbor, she'd hide it. The only problem was, her fence encroached 3 feet into my lot. I measured it twice to be sure, then called the county surveyor, who confirmed it officially. Instead of confronting her right away, I let her finish the whole project, paint, posts, and all. When she finally stood admiring her handiwork, I walked over with the surveyor in tow. "Nice fence," I said. "Shame about the location." She blinked. "Excuse me." The surveyor showed her the map. "You're 3 feet over the line, ma'am," he said. "You'll need to remove this section." She went pale, then red. "That can't be right," she snapped. "This is common property." The surveyor shook his head. "It's not. It's his. See the marker right here." He pointed to a metal stake embedded in the ground, one she'd apparently built over. Karen glared at me like I'd forged the earth itself. "You're doing this to humiliate me," she said. I smiled. "No, Karen, gravity and geometry did this. I just brought the tape measure." 2 days later, the fence was gone, but replaced by a new tactic. I came home to find an HOA sign posted at the entrance of the walking trail. Harbor access temporarily restricted for community review. Beneath it, in smaller letters, "Non-compliance under evaluation." It was so laughably fake that even my neighbor Dan texted, "Did Karen print that on her home computer again?" But this time, I took a different approach. I called the county zoning office and asked if any entity had filed for a restriction on my property. They checked, confirmed no such filing existed, and asked for a copy of the sign. When I sent it over, they got very interested. Apparently, impersonating official zoning authority is not just frowned upon, it's a violation of municipal code. By Friday, a county officer knocked on Karen's door. I watched from my porch as she argued on her front step, gesturing wildly. The officer handed her a citation notice, an actual, legal one this time. Later that evening, she drove past my house slowly, glaring daggers, her headlights lingering on my dock. I waved cheerfully. That's when I knew she was about to do something truly stupid. And I was right. The following week, I discovered she'd filed an official HOA motion to reclaim community ownership of shoreline amenities. She'd attached 30 pages of photos, bylaws, and maps, half of which weren't even of my property. One image was of a completely different lake. Her obsession had turned into a crusade, and the board was starting to get nervous. A few even reached out privately, saying they didn't support her anymore but were too scared to oppose her directly. I told them not to worry. I had a plan, A way to end it once and for all, using the very system she'd tried to weaponize against me. It was time to go from defense to offense, and it would start with a single envelope, addressed to the HOA treasurer, containing copies of all 27 of my invoices, this time marked outstanding balance due. When I mailed those invoices to the HOA treasurer, I didn't expect much more than a few laughs. They were all clearly labeled, for documentation purposes only, at the bottom, but they looked real enough to make an accountant flinch. Each one bore its matching complaint number, Karen's signature, and my calculated fee for the alleged incidents, $250 here for visual trespass, $500 there for unauthorized photography. It was theater, really, but meticulously crafted theater. What I hadn't anticipated was how seriously the treasurer, a meticulous man named Howard, would take them. 2 days later, he called me sounding both nervous and intrigued. I received your package," he said cautiously. "I wasn't aware of these financial interactions with the HOA president." I told him, in my most measured tone, that they weren't financial transactions, they were counter-documentation for personal record-keeping. "But," I added, "since she's filed official HOA complaints, I assumed they'd be part of the community's administrative trail." He paused. "Technically, they would be," he admitted, "if they're in response to board correspondence." That one line was all I needed. That night, I updated my spreadsheet. What started as a joke had become a fully indexed archive complete with timestamps, cross-references, and photographic evidence. My wife walked in as I was printing binders. "You're building a legal novel," she said. "You planning to sell the movie rights?" I grinned. "Not yet, but the plot's getting good." The next HOA meeting was only 3 days away, and I knew Karen would use it to try and frame me as some unhinged troublemaker. But this time, I'd come armed with something even she couldn't twist. Her own paper trail, turned against her with precision. The meeting began as expected. Karen, ever the queen of performative outrage, opened with a speech about integrity and community respect. She gestured grandly toward a stack of papers beside her, claiming they represented the ongoing harassment campaign by one resident. That would be me. She even printed a few of my joke invoices to wave around dramatically. "He's turned the HOA into a mockery," she declared, her voice trembling with indignation. "He's weaponized fake billing to intimidate leadership." I waited for her to finish before standing up with my binder. "If we're talking about weaponized paperwork," I said evenly, "then we should review the entire arsenal." I began reading from the earliest complaint, her first one about unpermitted harbor usage. Then the second, visual obstruction. Then the third, noise disturbances. Each time, I flipped the page and displayed the corresponding invoice I'd sent in return. The room rippled with muffled laughter. "You'll notice," I said, "that every one of my invoices directly mirrors a complaint she initiated. Equal and opposite documentation. It's not harassment, it's accountability." Karen tried to interrupt, but the treasurer cleared his throat. "Actually, Ms. Whitmore," he said, "since these documents were sent in direct response to your filings, they do count as relevant HOA correspondence." Her jaw fell open. For a few seconds she was speechless, a rare and beautiful sight. By the time I reached complaint number 27, the mood in the room had shifted completely. What started as her stage had become mine. People were chuckling openly now, shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. When I concluded, I simply said, "If the HOA feels burdened by this paperwork, I suggest fewer baseless complaints." Cause and effect. A round of polite applause followed. Karen's expression darkened to the color of storm clouds. She tried to regain control by proposing a new bylaw, something about prohibiting frivolous counter-documentation. The motion failed before it even reached a vote. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me privately, some amused, others impressed. One older couple admitted they'd stopped attending HOA gatherings years ago because of Karen's reign of terror. Another neighbor whispered, You're the first person who's ever stood up to her." That night, my wife joked that I'd become the harbor hero. It wasn't exactly a title I'd wanted, but it was satisfying nonetheless. Of course, Karen didn't take her defeat quietly. The very next morning, I received a letter marked urgent from the HOA Compliance Committee, a newly formed group that, coincidentally, didn't exist until the day after the meeting. Its sole purpose, according to the document, was to review and approve all future harbor-related activity. In other words, Karen had invented a committee just to keep harassing me. I had to admire her persistence. She didn't even rest for 24 hours. This time, I didn't go through the HOA. I went straight to the county. My property, after all, bordered state-regulated shoreline, and my dock was fully permitted through them, not the HOA. I scheduled an inspection with the county assessor's office and made sure to copy Karen on every email. Within a week, a county representative named Angela arrived to verify my paperwork. She was professional, courteous, and clearly familiar with HOA nonsense. "We get this a lot," she said, glancing at the stack of complaints Karen had filed. "Some boards don't understand their jurisdiction stops where private property begins." She spent half an hour reviewing my documents, then handed me an official letter certifying that my dock and harbor were 100% compliant with county regulations. "You might want to frame this," she said with a wink. Naturally, I did. And I also made sure to post a copy of that letter inside the Karen archive display by the dock. The sight of that official county seal glinting in the sunlight was like a mosquito repellent for Karens. She saw it the next day while walking her dog and froze mid-step. "You called the county?" she snapped, voice trembling. "You went above the board?" I shrugged. "Just following protocol." She clenched her fists. "You'll regret undermining the HOA." I smiled. "No, I'll enjoy watching it uphold the law." 2 days later, she called an emergency HOA session to discuss external interference in community matters. Only 3 people showed up. Most of the board had quietly resigned or taken personal leave. Her once loyal second-in-command, Greg, didn't even attend. When I passed by later that evening, I saw her alone in the meeting hall, staring at her laptop, typing furiously. Whatever she was doing, I knew it wouldn't be rational. Sure enough, the next escalation came in the form of a formal complaint filed with the local lake management authority. She accused me of waterway obstruction, claiming my harbor impeded community boating routes. The authority responded by scheduling an on-site review. When the officer arrived, he looked at my dock, then at the open, empty expanse of lake beyond it, and said flatly, "What route?" I pointed to where Karen's backyard was visible. "Maybe she meant the one between her deck chair and her ego," I suggested. He laughed. "We'll file this under no action necessary." That evening, I sat on my dock with a cold drink, watching the sun dip low over the water. It should have felt like victory, but part of me knew it wasn't over yet. Karen's silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. Sure enough, I found out later that she'd been emailing the HOA insurance provider, trying to convince them that my harbor posed a liability risk to the neighborhood. It was almost impressive how relentless she was, like a storm that refused to pass. But by then, she'd made one critical mistake. She'd created a massive, traceable trail of harassment that extended far beyond community management. Mark, my lawyer, called me one evening after reviewing the growing mountain of documentation. "You know," he said, "at this point, you could file for harassment and property interference. You'd win easily." I told him I wasn't interested in court unless she forced my hand. He laughed. "You're playing a longer game than she can even see." He was right. The goal wasn't to crush Karen, it was to let her collapse under the weight of her own nonsense. Over the next few weeks, I stayed quiet. I trimmed the hedges, cleaned the dock, and said nothing to anyone. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to unravel publicly. She'd stand on her porch staring toward my property, muttering into her phone. People started avoiding her. One day, I overheard two neighbors whispering that she'd been called out by the board for misuse of authority. Apparently, Howard the treasurer had submitted a formal inquiry into her conduct after reviewing how much time and money she'd wasted on baseless filings. When the HOA finally called for a leadership vote, I didn't even attend. I didn't need to. Karen lost her presidency in a landslide. She stormed out of the meeting, declaring everyone ungrateful. That night, I noticed her porch light stayed off for the first time in months. The neighborhood felt different, calmer, lighter, like the air had been cleared. My wife and I celebrated quietly with takeout on the dock. She raised her glass. "You won," she said. I shook my head. "Not yet. She'll make one last move." And she did. A week later, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an invoice from Karen herself, demanding payment for emotional distress caused by retaliatory harassment. The amount? $6,750. The exact total I'd billed her. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped it in the lake. "She's finally learned your game," my wife said. "Yeah," I replied, holding it up to the sunlight, "but she's playing it backwards." What Karen didn't realize was that by imitating my invoices, she'd admitted to recognizing them as satire, not legitimate financial claims. And that tiny detail would become the final thread in the web she'd spun around herself. Because now every board member, neighbor, and county official could see the truth. Karen's entire crusade wasn't about rules or property. It was about ego. And I was about to make sure that ego sank faster than a cinder block in my harbor. The morning after I received Karen's ridiculous invoice, I stood on my dock sipping coffee and watching the reflection of her house ripple across the water. There was a strange calm between us now, a lull that almost felt like the end of a long, absurd war. But I knew better than to trust silence from her side of the fence. Karen didn't stop, she reloaded. Still, I decided to treat her latest stunt for what it was, a confession wrapped in pettiness. By billing me the same amount I'd billed her, she'd essentially acknowledged that my invoices were satire, not harassment. That realization made me smile. It was the kind of self-incrimination you couldn't buy. My wife walked out onto the deck, reading the letter again and shaking her head. "She wants $7,500 for emotional distress," she said. "That's either genius or insanity." I shrugged. "Probably both. But it's also useful." My plan was simple. Document, expose, and then let the system do the rest. The HOA had already turned against her, but the real nail in her coffin would come from her own correspondence trail. Over the past few months, she had built a veritable encyclopedia of entitlement, all publicly traceable, all self-authored. So I gathered everything. Her 27 complaints, her fake stop work notices, the bogus restricted access sign, even her fence violation photos. Then I packaged them neatly into a single file labeled Pattern of Harassment, HOA President Whitmore. It wasn't malicious, it was self-defense, wrapped in administrative precision. I submitted the file to the HOA's Oversight Committee, which Howard now chaired after Karen's removal. When he read through it, he called me immediately. "This is staggering," he said, sounding genuinely stunned. I had no idea how far she'd gone. I told him I didn't want to cause more drama. I just wanted peace and for the HOA to enforce its own code of conduct. He sighed. "You've done more than that. You've basically built the case for her removal from the board entirely." I didn't say it aloud, but that was the goal all along. Let her hoist herself with her own clipboard. The next HOA gathering was quieter than usual. Karen still showed up, technically still a board member, though no longer president. She looked diminished, somehow, same pearls, same perfect hair, but the authority had drained out of her posture. I stayed in the back, saying nothing while Howard called the meeting to order. When he reached the behavioral conduct item on the agenda, he cleared his throat. "We've received a formal report documenting a pattern of misconduct by a member of this board," he began. Karen stiffened immediately. These include unauthorized enforcement actions, fabricated notices, and misuse of HOA authority. Her face turned the color of sunburn. She tried to interrupt, but Howard held up a hand. "You will have time to respond after we review the evidence." He began distributing copies of the packet I'd compiled. The room filled with rustling paper and soft murmurs. A few people gasped softly as they read the stop work order sign and the restricted access notice. Someone whispered, "She actually nailed that to his dock?" When Howard reached the final page, Karen's invoice for emotional distress, he couldn't help but snort. "And this," he said dryly, "appears to be a parody of the very documents she accused another member of misusing." A few people laughed outright. Karen rose from her seat, trembling with indignation. "This is character assassination," she cried. "You're all turning on me because I enforce the rules." But Howard stayed calm. "No, Karen. You invented your own rules." He paused, then added, "The motion is to remove you from the board effective immediately." The vote was nearly unanimous. The one abstention came from Greg, who looked like he'd rather melt into his chair than face her wrath. When the result was announced, Karen stood there in stunned silence, then abruptly gathered her things and stormed out. The door slammed so hard the blinds rattled. The room stayed quiet for a few seconds, and then someone muttered, "Well, that's a relief." I didn't gloat or smile. I just exhaled. It wasn't victory, it was release. That night, I sat out by the water again, staring at the faint glow of her house across the lake. It felt strange not to hear her voice echoing in my inbox or see her notes taped to my gate. My wife joined me, handing me a beer. "So that's it?" she asked. "She's gone." I nodded slowly. "Maybe from the board," I said. "But she's not done yet. People like her don't quit, they simmer." And I was right. 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived from a law office downtown, an actual one this time. The letter accused me of emotional and reputational damages caused by my public display of defamatory material. It demanded I take down the Karen archive from my dock within 72 hours or face a civil suit. I couldn't even be mad. The sheer audacity was almost artistic. I sent the letter to Mark, my attorney, who called me within the hour. "You've got to admire her persistence," he said, amused. "But this is paper thin. Truth is an absolute defense to defamation, and every item on that board is an official HOA document she authored." He offered to send a formal reply, but I had a better idea. The next morning, I replaced the glass cover on the Karen archive with a new panel etched in small lettering. "All documents displayed are official HOA communications filed by former President Karen Whitmore, publicly available under community transparency bylaws." It was factual, neutral, and legally airtight. I even took photos of the updated display with timestamps, just in case. My wife joked that I should start charging an admission fee for tourists. By that evening, neighbors were once again stopping by to read it, smiling and shaking their heads. Karen must have seen them, because around dusk, I caught sight of her standing at the end of her driveway, glaring across the water like a general without an army. But her next move surprised even me. Instead of suing immediately, she launched a campaign. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes, cheaply printed, all-caps manifestos warning of unchecked harassment and toxic neighbors undermining community harmony. Every one of them was signed Concerned Residents Coalition, though the printer marks on the bottom matched the same brand of inkjet she used for her first violation notices. It was almost poetic how she'd come full circle. The community didn't buy it. In fact, the backlash was swift. People started posting sarcastic, concerned resident memes online, photos of their dogs wearing sunglasses with captions like "Petition to ban unauthorized sunshine." Even the local Facebook group moderator had to lock comments because of how out of hand the jokes got. The more Karen pushed, the more ridiculous she looked. Her reputation, once built on intimidation, was now dissolving in ridicule. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. Late one evening, as the sun sank low and the lake turned gold, I saw Karen walking slowly toward my property. No clipboard, no papers, just her and that same rigid posture. I met her halfway down the path, cautious but curious. She stopped a few feet away, her face drawn and tired. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said quietly. Her voice didn't have its usual venom, it was weary, brittle. "You humiliated me." I said nothing, just waited. She looked out at the water. "I was only trying to maintain order. This neighborhood used to respect the rules before people like you moved in." I almost felt sorry for her then. Almost. "Karen," I said, "the problem isn't rules. It's control. You wanted everyone to live in your version of order." She scoffed, then muttered, "You're just smug because everyone's on your side now." I shook my head. "No, Karen. I'm calm because I stopped playing your game." That seemed to hit her harder than anything else I could have said. She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away. For the first time since this whole saga began, she didn't leave with a threat. Just silence. I thought maybe that was the end of it. Weeks passed without incident. The HOA resumed normal business, neighbors smiled again, and the air around the lake felt lighter. But just when I started to believe peace had returned, a letter arrived from the county tax office. It stated that someone had filed a property boundary dispute claiming my dock extended beyond my deeded line. I didn't even need to guess who was behind it. Karen might have been out of office, but she still had her claws. Thankfully, I'd kept everything. Survey maps, official certifications, even Angela's county inspection report. Within 24 hours, Mark filed a counterstatement attaching all the necessary documentation. The county's response was swift. Claim dismissed for lack of merit. I sent a copy of the dismissal to the HOA, just for transparency. That's when Howard called me again. "You know," he said, "the board voted to censure Karen permanently. She's banned from filing any further community complaints without majority approval." I didn't even bother hiding my grin. That might be the first sensible bylaw this place has ever passed. That weekend, I walked down to the dock again and stood by the water. The Karen archive gleamed softly under the morning sun. My wife joined me, handing me a mug of coffee. "So that's really it now?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said. "Her reign's officially over." But as we stood there, watching a heron glide low over the lake, I couldn't help one last thought. Karen had spent months trying to dominate a community, weaponizing rules, paperwork, and intimidation. And in the end, she destroyed her own authority without me ever raising my voice. I hadn't beaten her with anger or revenge. I'd beaten her with patience, humor, and her own signatures. Still, I had one final gesture left. I printed one more invoice, number 28. Administrative closure fee, $0. Paid in full. I slipped it quietly into her mailbox that evening. It wasn't mockery. It was punctuation. The story, finally, had its period. At least, that's what I thought, until 2 weeks later, when I received a certified envelope from a new HOA president with the subject line, Community Reconciliation Proposal. Inside was a request for me to collaborate on rebuilding neighborly trust and unity. And the first item on the agenda? Reconsideration of harbor usage policy. Karen might have been gone, but her legacy, her chaos, had taken root in the bylaws themselves. And I knew then, standing by the water under a fading sunset, that this story wasn't just about one Karen. It was about every petty tyrant who ever believed paperwork could outlast patience. But I also knew something else. No matter what new president stepped up next, they'd think twice before filing complaint number 28. When I got that letter from the new HOA president asking me to participate in their so-called community reconciliation proposal, I almost laughed out loud. After everything that had happened, the idea of rebuilding neighborly trust felt like a bad sitcom plot. Still, part of me was curious. The letter was polite, professional, and refreshingly free of threats or passive-aggressive language. It came from a man named Richard Hayes, a retired civil engineer who'd recently moved into the neighborhood. He wasn't part of Karen's old guard. In fact, rumor had it he'd volunteered to clean up the mess she left behind. My wife raised an eyebrow as she read the letter over my shoulder. "Rebuilding trust," she said. "You mean the trust she burned to ashes?" I smirked. "Maybe he means rebuilding the harbor of peace." She laughed. "Just don't let them rope you into another circus." Despite her warning, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting out of sheer curiosity. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. Gone were the tense glares and whispered gossip that used to fill the room when Karen presided. Richard sat at the front table, flanked by Howard and a few new faces. He greeted everyone warmly, using phrases like "moving forward" and "restoring harmony." It was almost disarming. When he reached the agenda item about the harbor usage policy, the room grew quiet. He turned to me and said, "We'd like to discuss how we can ensure clarity around private and community spaces going forward." There was no accusation in his tone, just a genuine attempt to settle old dispute. I appreciated the civility, but I also knew better than to let my guard down completely. "Mr. Hayes," I said, "I'm open to discussing any policy updates, but I want to be clear that my harbor is private property and fully documented as such by the county." He nodded. "Yes, I've reviewed the files. There's no dispute there." He paused, then added, "However, there's still lingering confusion among residents about access and visibility, and I think we can resolve that together." It was the first time an HOA president had treated me like a partner instead of a problem. For a brief moment, I thought maybe the storm had finally passed. But of course, Karen couldn't stay out of it for long. She wasn't on the board anymore, but she still lived 2 streets over, and apparently she'd taken it upon herself to advise the new leadership. I learned this when a neighbor named Jenna, one of the new board members, approached me after the meeting. "Just a heads up," she whispered, "Karen's been trying to influence Richard behind the scenes. She told him you manipulated the system, and that you intimidate people with paperwork." I sighed. "Does he believe her?" Jenna shook her head. "No, but she's persistent. She keeps sending him old files." I thanked her for the warning and left the meeting with a familiar knot forming in my stomach. The next few weeks were uneventful, almost suspiciously calm. Then, one afternoon, I noticed a small boat tied up to my dock. It wasn't mine. A young man I didn't recognize was standing beside it, fiddling with a fishing pole. I walked down and asked what he was doing. Karen said this was part of the community waterfront," he said sheepishly. "She told me it was okay to fish here." I nearly laughed. "Did she now?" He looked embarrassed, apologized, and left immediately. That night, I sent a brief email to Richard explaining what had happened, attaching a photo of the boat and a polite reminder that trespassing wasn't covered under community access. His reply came quickly. "I'm so sorry," he wrote. "Karen has no authority to make statements on behalf of the board. I'll address this immediately." The next morning, Richard showed up at Karen's house with Howard. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but from my porch I could see her body language. Defensive, animated, arms flailing. Howard stood silently beside Richard, arms crossed, while Karen jabbed her finger toward the lake. Eventually, Richard turned and walked away, leaving her standing on her porch fuming. Later that afternoon, she retaliated in the most predictable way imaginable. She filed a police report claiming I was intentionally intimidating her by surveilling her home with cameras pointed at her property. I found out when a patrol officer showed up to ask a few routine questions. He was polite, even apologetic. "We got a call from a Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "She's claiming you have cameras directed at her windows." I smiled and showed him the footage from my security system. 2 small, fixed cameras aimed squarely at my driveway and dock. "Nothing faces her property," I said. He nodded, clearly unimpressed by her accusation. "Yeah, figured as much," he said. She's known around the station. Apparently, Karen had filed so many nuisance complaints over the years that the local police had started marking her reports as low priority unless verified. The officer left chuckling, and I thought that might finally scare her off. But instead, she doubled down. A few days later, I caught her standing near the walking path again, pointing her phone toward my house and snapping photos. I didn't confront her, I just waved. That simple gesture made her so flustered she nearly dropped her phone. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. One evening, Richard stopped by unexpectedly, looking uneasy. "I thought you should know," he said. "Karen filed a motion with the county claiming that the HOA leadership failed to protect her from harassment." I stared at him, speechless for a moment. "Harassment?" He nodded grimly. "She's saying the board enabled you by not taking action against your invoices and your dock display. It's absurd, but it's official. The county's reviewing it." I could tell he felt guilty just telling me. "Don't worry," I said calmly. "Let her file whatever she wants. It's all documented." He sighed. "I figured you'd say that. Still, it's frustrating. We're trying to rebuild trust, and she's dragging us back into her circus." As soon as he left, I called Mark. He was already aware of the filing. "Don't worry," he said. "The county's not going to take it seriously. They've seen her name before." He paused, then added, "But it might be time to think about going on offense. You've been reactive this whole time. Maybe it's time to end this officially." His tone was serious. "You mean file something against her?" I asked. "Exactly," he said. "Civil harassment, property interference, and defamation. You have every right to." For a few days I wrestled with the idea. I'd spent months outsmarting her, never losing my temper, never crossing a line. But now, the thought of dragging this feud into court felt heavy. My wife noticed me staring out at the lake one evening, lost in thought. "You're thinking about suing her," she said quietly. I nodded. "She won't stop unless someone makes her stop." She set down her mug. "Then do it. Not out of revenge, out of peace." So I did. Mark filed the complaint on my behalf, attaching every shred of evidence we'd collected: the trespassing photos, the falsified notices, the fake signs, and the police report. It was airtight. The summons was served to Karen 2 days later, and the entire neighborhood found out before she could spin the story. That weekend, I noticed her car was gone most of the day. When she returned, she looked defeated. For once, she didn't even glance toward my house. Weeks passed. The legal process crawled forward, but in the meantime, the neighborhood transformed. People started using the walking trail again. Kids rode bikes without fear of being scolded for rule violations. Howard even organized a small barbecue by the lake, the first community event in years that didn't end with shouting. I brought my grill, and for the first time in ages, people laughed about the whole saga. "Can you believe she actually filed 27 complaints?" someone said. "The woman had a hobby," another joked. The laughter felt cleansing, like rain washing away months of grime. Then, one morning, I received an email from Mark. Case dismissed. Settlement reached. Apparently, Karen had agreed to withdraw all pending claims, issue a formal written apology, and pay a small fine for falsifying HOA documents. It wasn't much, but it was something. When I opened the attached PDF, I saw her signature at the bottom: shaky, uneven, defeated. The apology itself was short and clinical, probably written by her lawyer, but seeing her admit wrongdoing felt surreal. My wife read it over my shoulder and said, "Frame it next to the archive." I didn't. Instead, I quietly removed the Karen archive display from my dock that afternoon. The wind was light, the water still. It felt symbolic, like lowering a flag at the end of a long campaign. As I took the last document down, I thought about how much time and energy this whole feud had consumed. Months of absurdity, stress, and tension, all because one woman couldn't stand the idea of losing control. When I was done, I stood there for a long while, staring at the empty frame. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about reclaiming peace. That evening, my wife joined me on the dock. "So," she asked, "now that it's over, what are you going to do with all those papers?" I smiled. "Keep them. Just in case the next president decides to get creative." She laughed softly. "You think there'll be another Karen?" I looked out over the water, the reflection of the moon shimmering across the lake. "There's always another Karen," I said. "But at least now I know how to deal with one." Still, deep down, a small part of me almost missed the chaos, the adrenaline of matching her every move, the satisfaction of watching her logic collapse under its own weight. But that thought vanished quickly as a soft breeze rippled the surface of the lake. For the first time in what felt like forever, the harbor was quiet, peaceful, mine again. And somewhere across the neighborhood, I imagined Karen sitting in her house surrounded by empty binders and broken pride, realizing that for all her rules and regulations, she'd lost the one thing she valued most: control. I didn't need to rub it in. The silence said everything. It had been 3 months since Karen's formal apology, and the neighborhood finally felt like a place people wanted to live again. The air was quieter, the HOA meetings shorter, and my harbor, once the most controversial patch of water in the county, had gone back to being what it was meant to be: a quiet place to fish, think, and breathe. The water reflected the early morning light, smooth as glass, and I found myself sitting there every sunrise with coffee in hand, almost disbelieving that the madness had truly ended. My wife joked that I'd become the dock philosopher, spending more time out there than in the house. Maybe she was right. But after the storm Karen had dragged us through, silence had become a luxury I didn't take for granted. Most neighbors had moved on, treating the whole saga like a bizarre chapter in local folklore. People still brought it up at barbecues, laughing about Harborgate and the infamous 27 Invoices. The story had become legend, a cautionary tale about what happens when one person mistakes control for leadership. Even Richard, the new HOA president, often said at meetings, "Let's keep things simple, no more paperwork wars." He always glanced my way when he said it, half joking, half grateful. For the first time in years, the HOA actually functioned like it was supposed to, fixing potholes, organizing events, approving paint colors without turning it into a political summit. Life had balance again. Then, one breezy afternoon in early spring, a white SUV pulled up near my driveway. I recognized it instantly: Karen's. I hadn't seen her since the settlement, and for a moment I considered pretending not to be home. But curiosity got the better of me. She stepped out slowly, wearing sunglasses and a neutral expression. No clipboard, no papers, no entourage. Just her. She hesitated before walking up the path, stopping a few feet short of the porch. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, missing its old sharpness. I nodded and gestured toward the dock. We stood there in silence for a minute, the water lapping gently against the post. She looked older, somehow. The months of public embarrassment and legal battles had worn her down. "I didn't come to start anything," she said finally. "I just wanted to explain." I didn't respond, just waited. She sighed and looked out at the lake. "When I joined the HOA, I thought I could make this place better. My husband had just passed away, and running things gave me a sense of control. It felt like something I could still manage." Her tone wasn't defensive, it was human. For the first time, she sounded like someone who'd lost more than power. "And then you built that harbor, and everyone talked about how nice it was, how peaceful it looked, and it just—" She paused, searching for the words. It felt unfair. Like I was losing control of the only thing I had left. I didn't know what to say. For months I'd painted her in my mind as a villain, but standing there, she just looked like someone who'd gotten lost inside her own insecurities. "Karen," I said slowly, "you didn't need control to have respect. You just needed perspective." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Well, I certainly got plenty of that." She turned to face me. I've decided to sell the house. Too many memories here. People look at me and see the woman who declared war on a dock. She smiled faintly. It's not exactly a legacy. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, but I didn't. Instead, I felt something close to pity. Where are you going? I asked. Somewhere without an HOA, she said. We both laughed at that, an honest, shared laugh that broke months of tension. Before she left, she said something that stuck with me. You know, for what it's worth, I think you handled all of this better than I would have. I expected you to fight back, to scream, to make it ugly. But you didn't. You just outlasted me. I told her it wasn't about winning. It was about peace, I said. That's all I ever wanted. She nodded quietly and walked back to her car. As she drove away, I realized that, in her own strange way, that conversation was the real closure I'd been waiting for. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood watched her house go up for sale. A "for sale" sign stood in her immaculate front yard, and little by little, her presence faded. No more SUVs parked outside the HOA office, no more flyers in mailboxes, no more whispered rumors. When the moving trucks finally came, I stood on my porch and watched as boxes disappeared into the back. The last thing she loaded was her old metal filing cabinet, the same one that had once held the mountain of complaints she'd sent me. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. When the truck drove off, it felt like a collective exhale for the whole community. Richard stopped by later that evening, holding 2 beers. It's officially over, he said, handing me one. Her sale closed this morning. We clinked bottles. You know, he added with a smirk, I should have hired you as HOA consultant. You've done more for this place than any board ever did. I laughed. I'll pass. I like my sanity. He nodded toward the lake. Still, it's funny. All that chaos over a dock. I looked out at the calm water. It was never about the dock, I said. It was about control. He thought for a moment, then nodded. And now she doesn't have it. Summer rolled in quietly after that. The lake shimmered brighter than ever, the grass greener, the nights warmer. The neighborhood started hosting events again. Fishing contests, outdoor movie nights, and even a little harbor fair, which the HOA asked me to host. I agreed on one condition, that they install a small plaque near the dock, not to commemorate the feud, but as a tongue-in-cheek reminder of the lesson learned. The plaque read simply, "Respect boundaries, both property and personal." Everyone loved it. The harbor fair was a hit. Kids ran along the pier, neighbors mingled without tension, and for the first time in years, the sound of laughter echoed louder than gossip. As the sun set over the lake, my wife leaned against me and said, "You realize you turned a war into a festival?" I smiled. Sometimes peace just needs a good party. But even as everything settled, I couldn't help reflecting on the strange chain of events that had brought me here. Karen's complaints, my invoices, the endless paperwork, all of it had been ridiculous on the surface, yet somehow it exposed something deeper about human nature. People crave control when they feel powerless. They cling to rules when life feels unpredictable. Karen's obsession hadn't really been about me or my harbor, it was about her need to feel significant. And in trying to impose her will on everyone else, she'd lost herself. I almost felt grateful for the ordeal because it taught me something I hadn't known I needed to learn, that sometimes patience and silence are stronger weapons than anger. Months later, long after she'd moved away, I received a letter postmarked from another state. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Karen. My wife saw it first and raised an eyebrow. "You're not seriously going to open that, are you?" she asked. "After everything?" I shrugged. Curiosity's a curse. I opened it carefully. The letter was short, handwritten, and surprisingly sincere. She wrote that she'd bought a small house near a lake up north. "No HOA this time," she'd underlined. "I just wanted to say thank you. You made me realize that control isn't the same thing as peace. I hope you're still enjoying your harbor." For a long moment I didn't say anything. Then I folded the letter neatly and slipped it into the same binder where I'd once kept her complaint. My wife asked if I was going to frame it. No, I said. That one's just for me. Life went on. The HOA continued under Richard's steady leadership, and the neighborhood transformed into something unrecognizable compared to the battlefield it had been. New families moved in, kids played by the water, and every once in a while, someone new would ask about the story of the invoices. I'd just smile and say, let's just call it a lesson in patience. The legend lived on, not as a feud but as folklore, a reminder of what happens when one person mistakes power for purpose. One quiet evening, as the sun sank low over the lake and the light turned gold, I sat on my dock again. The water lapped softly, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter from across the trail, and I thought about how far everything had come. There was no more tension, no more battles, no more petty wars. Just peace. I looked down at my reflection in the water and realized something that made me laugh out loud. After all those months of invoices, meetings, and chaos, I'd ended up doing exactly what Karen always claimed she wanted to do: maintain the beauty and order of the community. The difference was, I'd done it by letting go. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the wooden boards warm beneath me, and whispered to the empty lake, "Paid in full, Karen." The water rippled softly, like an acknowledgement. Somewhere, maybe far away by another lake, I hoped she'd found the same peace. Because in the end, that's what this had all been about. Not revenge, not victory, but learning how to let go without losing yourself. As night fell, the harbor lights flickered on, casting long reflections across the still surface. My wife joined me, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Thinking about her again?" she asked. I shook my head. "Thinking about everything." She smiled and squeezed my hand. "You always were the calm one." I smiled back. Calm beats Karen every time. We both laughed, the kind of easy, genuine laughter that only comes when the war is long over and the peace feels permanent. And as the crickets began to sing and the moon rose high above the water, I realized that the true victory wasn't in outsmarting her or winning the lawsuit. It was in reclaiming the serenity she'd tried to steal. My harbor was still mine, my home was still my peace, and my patience, tested, stretched, but never broken, had outlasted every complaint, every confrontation, and every ounce of her chaos. The story had come full circle, ending not with a shout or a slam of a gavel, but with the soft sound of waves against wood and the quiet certainty that some battles aren't won with power, they're won with peace.